The quietest kindness in the room always reveals the loudest truth. I had learned that long before I ever met Adrian Romano, but I never imagined that a few simple movements of my hands would change the course of my life forever. Friday nights at Bella Vista were always overwhelming. Crystal glasses chimed beneath soft jazz. Polished silver reflected the warm glow of chandeliers, and every table seemed filled with people who wore confidence as naturally as expensive suits. I was 24, painfully shy, and halfway through another double shift, hoping my tips would be enough to cover next month's rent and one more payment toward community college. I kept my eyes low, my smile polite, and my footsteps light as I carried another tray across the dining room. Most guests never remembered my face, and that was perfectly fine with me. Invisible people made fewer mistakes. The front doors opened just after 7, and the entire atmosphere shifted. Conversations softened without anyone asking. The hostess straightened her jacket. Even the manager hurried toward the entrance with the kind of nervous smile reserved for people whose names carried weight. For men in tailored dark suits entered first, scanning the room with calm professionalism before stepping aside for a tall man in a charcoal suit. He looked to be in his early 30s, broad shoulders filling the jacket effortlessly, dark hair neatly combed back, his expression composed without appearing cold. Beside him walked an elegant woman with silver hair and gentle blue eyes. She held herself with quiet dignity, though I noticed something everyone else seemed to miss. While the manager welcomed them with practiced enthusiasm, she never reacted. She simply watched his lips, trying to follow every word. The manager continued speaking louder, believing volume would somehow help. I recognized that look immediately. My grandmother had worn the same patient smile for years before she passed away. She had been deaf, and she had taught me that hearing and understanding were never the same thing. Before I realized what I was doing, I stepped forward with a warm smile and raised my hands. "Good evening. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you here." I signed every word naturally. The elegant woman's eyes widened in surprise. For a heartbeat, the restaurant disappeared. Then her face softened into the brightest smile I had ever seen. She answered in fluent American Sign Language, thanking me and joking that I was the first server in years who had greeted her instead of speaking around her. I laughed silently as my hands replied that everyone deserved to be welcomed in their own language. Around us, conversations faded completely. Forks stopped halfway to plates. Even the musicians missed a note. I only noticed the silence when I saw the tall man watching me from a few feet away. His steady green eyes never left my hands, and for the first time that evening, the most powerful person in the room wasn't looking at the menu. He was looking at me as if I had just reminded him of something money had never been able to buy. For the rest of the evening, I could feel his eyes finding me no matter where I moved. It was not the uncomfortable stare I had learned to ignore from impatient customers or curious strangers. It was quieter than that, almost thoughtful, as though he was trying to solve a question that had followed him for years. His mother, Margaret, made everything wonderfully easy. She signed with warmth, laughed with her whole face, and thanked me every single time I refilled her water glass or brought another basket of warm bread. She even teased me about the chocolate cake, signing that life was too short to skip dessert. I answered that my grandmother had believed the exact same thing, and Margaret smiled so brightly that the lines around her eyes seemed to disappear. When I returned with their meals, I noticed the man called Adrian watching our conversation instead of his phone, his business associates, or the expensive bottle of wine resting untouched beside him. Every few minutes, his mother reached for my attention to ask another question. Where did I learn American Sign Language? Did I still practice every day? Did I have family nearby? I answered honestly. My grandmother lost her hearing before I was born. She raised me after school, while my mother worked long shifts at the hospital. Signing had never felt like learning another language. It simply felt like learning how to love someone completely. Margaret pressed her fingertips gently over her heart before signing that my grandmother must have been very proud of me. I had to blink quickly before my eyes became watery. It had been 3 years since I lost her, but somehow those words still reached the place where grief quietly lived. As I cleared their dinner plates, Adrian finally spoke directly to me. His voice was calm and surprisingly gentle. "You did not learn that for a job, did you?" I shook my head. "No, sir. I learned it because someone I loved deserved to be understood." He held my gaze for a long second before giving a slow nod. almost as if my answer confirmed something he had hoped was true. Before I could excuse myself, another table called my name, and I hurried away, embarrassed by the attention. The dinner rush carried me from one end of the restaurant to the other until nearly closing time. When the Romano family stood to leave, Margaret surprised me by taking both of my hands into hers. She signed that tonight had been the first time in years she had felt like everyone else instead of someone who needed accommodation. My throat tightened as I thanked her. Then she gently squeezed my fingers, looked toward her son with a playful smile, and signed something much too quickly for me to catch. Adrian looked almost amused for the first time all night before opening the door for her. As they disappeared into the cool evening air, I told myself it had simply been another shift, another table, another goodbye. I had no way of knowing that someone inside that family had already decided our paths would cross again very soon. The weekend passed, but I could not stop thinking about Margaret Romano's smile. It lingered in my memory the way the scent of fresh bread stayed in the dining room long after closing. Monday evening arrived with another busy shift, another pressed uniform, and another promise to myself that I would focus on work instead of wondering whether I would ever see that family again. Bella Vista filled quickly with regular customers escaping the cool spring rain, and I slipped back into the quiet rhythm that always calmed me. Refill water. Deliver Waitress. Clear empty plates. Smile. Thank you. Repeat. Around 6:30, I noticed a familiar figure standing outside the front window. Margaret was there alone except for a gray-haired chauffeur waiting several steps behind her. The moment our eyes met through the glass, she lifted both hands with an excited smile and signed that she hoped I was working tonight. I hurried to the entrance and welcomed her inside. She admitted with a playful grin that she had insisted on returning because she wanted another slice of chocolate cake and another conversation that did not require anyone to translate her thoughts. I laughed and led her to her favorite booth by the window. For nearly an hour, she told me stories about traveling across New England with her late husband decades earlier, about learning to read lips after losing her hearing, and about refusing to let silence define her life. Listening to her felt strangely comforting, like talking with my grandmother all over again. As we signed back and forth, I almost forgot anyone else was in the restaurant until I noticed Adrian standing quietly near the entrance. He had arrived without interrupting us. Instead of joining the conversation immediately, he simply watched his mother laugh so freely that several nearby diners could not help smiling with her. There was something different about him tonight. The guarded expression I remembered had softened into quiet gratitude. When he finally approached the table, Margaret signed something teasingly toward him before pointing at me. Adrian exhaled a small laugh and shook his head as though she had embarrassed him. Then he looked at me and said, "I have not seen her this happy in a very long time." I did not know how to answer such an honest sentence. I simply smiled and told him that she made conversation very easy. He glanced toward his mother before speaking again, his voice almost reflective. "Most people notice her hearing loss before they notice her. You noticed her first." His words settled over me more heavily than he probably intended. I had never considered that something so natural to me could mean so much to someone else. As I returned to my next table, I felt his eyes follow me once more, not with curiosity anymore, but with quiet respect that neither of us knew would soon be tested. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret became my favorite surprise. She never called ahead. She simply appeared once or twice a week with the same warm smile and the same eager hands ready to tell another story. Sometimes Adrian joined her. Sometimes he stayed only long enough to make sure she was comfortable before disappearing into phone calls that always seemed important. I never asked what he did for a living. Whatever the answer was, it belonged to his world, not mine. Mine was measured in hourly wages, college assignments, and whether I could stretch a grocery budget through another weekend. One rainy Thursday, the dinner rush arrived all at once. Every table was full, orders backed up in the kitchen, and my manager, Richard, wore the permanent frown that usually meant someone would become the target of his frustration. Unfortunately, that someone was often me. He stopped beside the service station just as I finished polishing a stack of glasses. "Emily, table 9 has been waiting too long. Stop chatting with customers and start doing your job." His voice carried farther than necessary. Several guests glanced toward us before quickly looking away. I apologized, even though I knew the delay had come from the kitchen. It was easier than arguing. 10 minutes later, A businessman at one of my tables snapped his fingers impatiently when I arrived with his entree. He complained that his steak was warmer than he preferred and questioned whether anyone in the restaurant knew how to provide proper service anymore. I offered to replace the meal immediately and sincerely apologized for the inconvenience. He sighed dramatically before muttering that people accepted jobs they clearly could not handle. The words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I simply nodded and carried the untouched plate back toward the kitchen. As I pushed through the swinging doors, I heard Richard blaming me again, telling another server that kindness did not make someone competent. I lowered my eyes and focused on balancing the plate. My grandmother used to tell me that dignity was something nobody could take unless I handed it away myself. I repeated those words silently whenever difficult days found me. When I stepped back into the dining room with the replacement meal, I caught a glimpse of Margaret watching everything from her booth by the window. Her gentle smile had disappeared. Beside her, Adrian had set down his coffee without taking a single sip. Neither of them interrupted. Neither of them said a word. Yet something about the quiet way they observed the room made the noisy restaurant suddenly feel very still. I finished serving the table with the same calm smile I offered every guest, unaware that the small moments I considered ordinary were revealing far more about every person in that room than any conversation ever could. The following morning felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight spilled through the apartment window, my coffee tasted a little too bitter, and my old sedan needed 3 attempts before the engine finally started. Nothing hinted that anything had changed. At Bella Vista, however, the atmosphere was different the moment I walked through the employee entrance. Richard was unusually quiet. He barely looked at anyone during the pre-shift meeting, and for the first time since I had started working there, he thanked the staff for showing up on time. I assumed he had simply woken up in a better mood. By lunchtime, whispers drifted through the kitchen. One server mentioned that the businessman from the previous evening had called to apologize to the restaurant and personally requested that his complaint be removed from the customer report. Another employee claimed the same man had left a generous tip with instructions that it be added to mine because he believed he had judged me unfairly. Nobody understood why the sudden change had happened. I certainly did not. I accepted the envelope without asking questions and quietly placed it inside my apron. Later that afternoon, Richard approached me while I was folding clean napkins. I braced myself for another lecture, but instead he cleared his throat awkwardly. He admitted the delay had not been my fault and thanked me for remaining professional during a stressful evening. It was not a dramatic apology. It was not even a comfortable conversation. Yet hearing those simple words felt surprisingly meaningful. Before walking away, he added that beginning next week I would be assigned more evening shifts because customers consistently requested my section. My heart skipped. Evening shifts meant better tips. Better tips meant I could finally replace the cracked laptop I had been using for school. As the dinner crowd arrived, Margaret entered with her familiar smile, and I greeted her in American Sign Language before she even reached her chair. She laughed and signed that she had wonderful news. Adrian had canceled an important meeting just so he could have dinner with her. A few moments later, he appeared carrying her light sweater over one arm. His expression remained calm, but there was an ease about him that had not been there during our first meeting. As I poured sparkling water into their glasses, he looked at me for a quiet moment before saying, "Sometimes people deserve to be treated the way they treat others." I smiled politely, assuming he was speaking in general. I thanked him and continued serving nearby tables, never realizing the sentence carried far more meaning than I could possibly understand. Somewhere beyond the dining room, invisible decisions had already been made, and although no one asked for recognition, kindness had begun opening doors that money alone never could. About a week later, I found a cream-colored envelope waiting beside the time clock before my shift. My name was written across the front in elegant handwriting that I recognized immediately. Inside was a simple invitation to Sunday dinner at the Romano estate. There was no formal language, no elaborate introduction, only a short handwritten note from Margaret saying that every family deserved at least one meal filled with easy conversation, and she hoped I would say yes. I must have read the note 5 times before slipping it carefully back into the envelope. I had never been invited to a place like that before. Sunday afternoon arrived with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze. I almost turned around twice during the drive, convinced that someone like me did not belong in a neighborhood where every home looked as though it belonged on the cover of an architecture magazine. When I finally reached the address, the gates opened before I even stopped my car. A friendly staff member welcomed me inside and guided me toward the front entrance. The estate was beautiful, but what surprised me most was how peaceful it felt. Instead of feeling cold or intimidating, it reminded me of an old family home that had simply collected more memories over the years. Margaret greeted me before anyone else could. She hugged me warmly and immediately began signing about the flowers blooming in her garden, proudly showing me roses she had planted with her husband decades earlier. We wandered through the garden together, laughing as she taught me the names of flowers I had never seen before. By the time we reached the dining room, I had almost forgotten where I was. Adrian stood near the fireplace, arranging framed photographs on a shelf. When he noticed us, his expression softened into the familiar quiet smile I had started recognizing. During dinner, nobody spoke about business. Nobody discussed wealth or influence. Instead, Margaret asked about my college classes, my favorite books, and whether I still baked my grandmother's apple pie recipe. I admitted that I still burned the crust almost every Thanksgiving, making her laugh so hard that she had to pause before signing another sentence. Adrian watched the exchange with unmistakable warmth. At one point he quietly said, "This room has been quieter for years than anyone should accept." He looked toward his mother before continuing, "You changed that without even trying." I shook my head, insisting that Margaret was simply easy to talk to. He smiled gently and replied, "Most people spend their lives hoping to be understood. You begin by understanding someone else." Those words stayed with me long after dessert was finished. As I drove home beneath the fading colors of the evening sky, I realized something had quietly changed. I had arrived believing I was visiting strangers. I left feeling as though I had been welcomed into a place where kindness mattered more than status. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt just a little brighter. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost too peaceful to question. My morning classes ended before noon, my evening shifts at Bella Vista kept me busy, and every Sunday, I found myself looking forward to another dinner with Margaret and Adrian. Somewhere along the way, their home stopped feeling unfamiliar. Margaret insisted I help her tend the garden before every meal, claiming the roses listened better when someone talked to them with kind hands. I laughed every time she signed that, although I secretly believed she might be right. One Tuesday evening, I finished my shift a little earlier than usual because business had slowed after a steady afternoon rain. As I walked toward the employee parking lot with my backpack over one shoulder, I noticed a dark sport utility vehicle parked across the street. I thought nothing of it. Cars came and went all the time in the city. I unlocked my old sedan, placed my bag inside, and was about to close the driver's door when another vehicle pulled quietly into the lot behind me. Adrian stepped out wearing a navy jacket instead of the tailored suits I had grown accustomed to seeing. He smiled politely, though there was an unusual seriousness in his eyes. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. I shook my head, surprised but happy to see him. Before I could ask why he was there, he glanced toward the street where the dark vehicle had been sitting only moments earlier. It pulled away almost immediately. His expression relaxed ever so slightly. "My mother forgot the book you recommended," he explained, holding up a familiar paperback novel with a faint smile. "She insisted I bring it before she forgot where she left it." I laughed softly, accepting the book, although I had a feeling there was another reason he had come himself instead of sending a driver. We stood beside my car for a few quiet minutes discussing classes, favorite authors, and Margaret's latest attempt to bake blueberry muffins from an online recipe. The conversation felt effortless, yet every so often Adrian casually looked around the nearly empty parking lot before returning his attention to me. Finally, I asked if everything was all right. He answered after a thoughtful pause. "Sometimes people become curious about those who matter to my family. Curiosity is not always harmful, but I prefer not to leave important things to chance." His words puzzled me. I assured him I was perfectly ordinary and probably the least interesting person anyone could follow. He smiled in a way that carried both warmth and quiet certainty. "Emily," he said gently, "ordinary people are often the ones worth protecting the most because they never expect anyone to protect them." I watched him drive away a few minutes later, still holding Margaret's book against my chest. As I started my own engine, I could not explain why his words echoed louder than the sound of the traffic around me, or why, for the first time in weeks, I felt that an invisible chapter of my life had just quietly begun. The question stayed with me for days. Why would someone like Adrian believe I needed protection? My life had always been wonderfully predictable. I drove the same aging sedan, worked the same evening shifts, attended the same college classes, and spent Sunday dinners listening to Margaret tell stories that somehow made ordinary moments feel unforgettable. Whatever world Adrian belonged to seemed distant from mine, separated by more than money or influence. Still, I could not ignore the quiet change in his behavior. Every time Margaret invited me to dinner, a driver appeared before I even considered making the trip alone. Whenever I finished a late shift, someone always seemed to be nearby without making their presence obvious. They never introduced themselves or interrupted my evening. They simply existed in the background like patient shadows that expected nothing in return. One Sunday after dinner, Margaret and I sat together on the back porch watching the last light settle over the garden. She reached for my hands and signed that happiness was easier to recognize after years of loneliness. I asked whether she had always been so optimistic. She smiled thoughtfully before explaining that losing her hearing had shown her who truly listened with their heart instead of their ears. Then she glanced toward the house where Adrian was speaking quietly on the telephone through the living room window. Her expression softened. She signed that her son had carried responsibilities long before he was old enough to understand them. She told me that people often admired strength without realizing how lonely it could become. I looked toward Adrian just as he finished his call. When he joined us, Margaret stood with a mischievous smile and gently squeezed both of our shoulders before disappearing inside, leaving us alone beneath the warm evening sky. For a few peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. The breeze carried the scent of blooming roses through the garden, while distant wind chimes echoed softly from the porch. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask the question that had lingered in my mind since the restaurant parking lot. Why have you been looking after me? Adrian looked toward the fading sunset before answering with complete honesty. Because my mother chose you before I ever understood why. I blinked, unsure I had heard him correctly. He smiled faintly and continued. I spent years trying to give her comfort. Expensive vacations, beautiful homes, the best doctors, every opportunity money could provide. Then you walked into a restaurant and greeted her in her own language without expecting anything in return. She came home smiling in a way I had not seen for years. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet emotion. You gave her something I never could. You reminded her that she was seen before she was accommodated. I felt my eyes fill with tears that I quickly brushed away, embarrassed by how deeply his words reached me. Adrian looked at me with gentle sincerity and added, sometimes the greatest gift a person offers is making someone else feel ordinary again, and that is exactly what you gave my mother. In that moment, I finally understood that our story had never begun because of power or wealth. It had begun because one simple act of kindness had found the one family that needed it most. The seasons changed almost without my noticing. Spring flowers gave way to the warmth of early summer. My evening shifts became easier, my grades improved, and Bella Vista slowly began to feel less like a workplace and more like the place where an unexpected chapter of my life had quietly begun. Margaret still insisted on Sunday dinners, although somewhere along the way they stopped feeling like invitations and started feeling like traditions. We cooked together, laughed together, and signed across the kitchen whenever our hands were too busy to speak aloud. Adrian often stood nearby with a cup of coffee, smiling at conversations he could only partly follow without asking us to slow down. One evening, as the golden light settled over the garden, Margaret gently reached into her pocket and handed me a small silver bracelet. A tiny rose charm hung beside a delicate hand shaped in the American Sign Language gesture for love. She signed that it had belonged to her for many years, but she wanted me to have it because family was not always created by birth. Sometimes it arrived quietly through kindness. My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. I tried to refuse such a meaningful gift, but she simply smiled and fastened it around my wrist herself. Adrian watched the moment in thoughtful silence before walking beside me through the garden after dinner. The roses were in full bloom, filling the evening air with a gentle fragrance that reminded me of my grandmother's backyard. We stopped beneath the oldest rose arbor on the property, and neither of us felt the need to rush the silence between us. Finally, he looked at me with the same calm honesty that had defined every important conversation we had ever shared. You never asked me for anything, he said quietly. Not a favor, not an opportunity, not even an explanation. You only cared whether my mother felt welcome. I smiled and answered that kindness should never depend on who someone was or what they owned. It should simply be given when it was needed. He nodded slowly before reaching for my hand with gentle respect. Then allow me to give you one promise instead, he said. No matter where life leads either of us, I will always protect the peace you brought into our family. I looked down at the silver bracelet catching the last rays of sunlight and realized that the greatest gifts I had received were never expensive. They were trust, belonging, friendship, and the feeling of being understood without pretending to be someone else. Looking back now, people sometimes assume my story changed because I met a powerful man. They are only seeing the ending. The truth is that everything changed the moment I chose compassion without expecting recognition. Money built beautiful houses, influence opened impressive doors, and success earned admiration. But none of those things healed a lonely heart. Sometimes the strongest language in the world is spoken without a single sound, and the smallest act of kindness can become the beginning of a family that destiny had been quietly writing all along.